Welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to join to welcome everybody here on for this virtual peer learning summit, where we're going to be exploring addressing climate change through integrated responses, linking adaptation and mitigation. So please, while we're getting everybody in and getting started, please find your way to the chat and say hello. It's great to see everybody introducing themselves there. Before we get started, you'll be used to this by now, that we're keeping cameras off unless invited to turn them on, and we will turn them on at various points in today's session. Microphones muted, use the chat box, and we'll be videoing and recording elements of the presentations in particular for limited distribution. So if we can move on to the next slide, I just want to briefly introduce, this is the team that's put today's session together. You'll be seeing and hearing a lot of us over the next few weeks as we work together on this summit. And we'll be working to support you to participate fully in the event and to get as much benefit from it as possible. We will get to meet each other and see and talk to each other later on in this session, but to get started, I'd like to invite Christian Ledwell, who's the manager of the NAP Global Network, to start with some welcome remarks.
Hi, thanks, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us for this virtual peer learning summit on addressing climate change through integrated responses by linking adaptation and mitigation. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Christian Ledwell, and I'm the manager of the NAP Global Network, and we're really thrilled to be co-hosting this event with the LEDS Global Partnership and in collaboration with GIZ. Here at the NAP Global Network, we've been seeing steady momentum behind that national adaptation planning around the world, with more and more countries making progress through planning and moving to implementation. While the global pandemic has caused challenges and delays, countries' adaptation priorities can guide where to invest if we want COVID-19 recovery to be green, fair, and resilient to a range of shocks and stresses. We hope to see COVID-19 recovery and climate adaptation go hand in hand. Recognizing that adaptation is just one side of the coin, this event will explore how we can create links between adaptation and mitigation efforts to increase synergies and avoid trade-offs. Many countries are already making major efforts to design well-coordinated climate planning processes. And for example, the UNFCCC's recent NDC synthesis report noted countries are choosing to put an increased focus on adaptation planning, and in particular on national adaptation plans in their new and enhanced nationally determined contributions. With the ambitious announcements made by world leaders on Earth Day last month on reaching net zero, and as countries scale up their mitigation efforts, adaptation remains essential to protect communities and ecosystems from the impacts of climate change that are already locked in. On a practical level, linking adaptation and mitigation just makes good sense. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and experiences on how to build these links between adaptation and mitigation. Thank you very much again, and I'll now pass to my colleague Berthe Derricks from the German Federal Ministry of the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Dear colleagues and partners, good morning and good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this peer learning summit on addressing climate change through integrated responses, organized jointly by the NAP Global Network and the LEDS Global Partnership. In the last years, and especially in the last months, we have seen how sustainable development, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, as well as healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are interconnected. It is therefore not surprising that there is an increasing interest and need for more integrated solutions that ultimately build resilience for people and for nature. To this end, synergies within and across sectors need to be identified and strengthened, while at the same time trade-offs need to be reduced where they are inevitable. Reducing climate vulnerabilities, conserving and restoring biodiversity, and achieving a just and fair sustainable development must be linked with the effective use of limited resources and respect for the planetary boundaries. It is key that recovery investments related to the pandemic, may it be multilateral or national funding, are directed towards truly sustainable and transformative change. Climate strategies such as long-term LEDs, NAPs, NDCs, but also NBSAPs are central policy instruments for countries to achieve those social, economic, and environmental goals. Through these instruments, governments can establish short, medium, and long-term priorities for transitioning to climate resilient, low-emission economies and societies. If planned jointly and holistically, these instruments can support and build upon each other while enhancing effectiveness of policy development and implementation, creating synergies toward the achievement of long-term climate and biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, silos are still present, separating mitigation and adaptation efforts, and platforms that support governments to elaborate integrated approaches are still hard to find. This is something that we are also working on at the International Climate Initiative, in short, ICI. Our four funding priorities, mitigation, adaptation, natural carbon sinks, including RED and RED Plus, and biodiversity, already cover many different aspects, and others working towards more holistic approaches for integrated planning and implementation of projects. However, there is still a lot we have to learn on how to effectively promote and strengthen integrated planning and provide the required financial and technical support. It is therefore very timely that the NAP Global Network and the Let's GP have partnered to organize this compelling and comprehensive peer learning summit. Both initiatives bring in that in-depth expertise from both the adaptation and mitigation side for holistic climate action to the table today, building on the huge knowledge of their strong and vibrant networks. With its peer learning approach, this event wants to bring different communities, country experiences, and voices together to jointly think and work towards new solutions that enable countries to develop just, sustainable, climate resilient, and also nature-friendly development pathways. With that in mind, I wish you all fruitful discussions, great inspirations, and joint learning. And I'm very much looking forward to the outcomes of this event. Thank you very much. And I think I hand over to my colleague, Felipe.
Thank you very much, Berta. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I join my colleagues in welcoming you to the first session of the Peer Learning Summit, Addressing Climate Change Through Integrated Responses, Linking Adaptation and Mitigation. So a couple of words on the Let's GP. The Let's Global Partnership is an accelerator of knowledge and solutions that lead the way to climate resilient and carbon neutral development. We are a vibrant platform driven by climate leaders that enables collaborative and ambitious climate action, peer learning, and innovation. The Global Secretariat of the Let's Global Partnership is co-hosted by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States, NREL, and GIZ here in Germany. We also have regional platforms engaging climate leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Caribbean that are supported by local organizations. So we have South-South-North in South Africa for the Africa LEDs partnership, ICLEI South Asia in India for the Asia LEDs partnership, and of course, Libellula in Peru, leading the work with Let's LAC. Our global working groups and communities of practice are our primary means for engaging with the climate community. They gather a wide range of stakeholders from national and subnational governments, the private sector, implementing agencies, NGOs, academia, and the civil society. These groups coordinate the thematic work on energy, climate finance, transportation, AFOLU, and resource efficiency. At the Let's Global Partnership, we foster leadership and innovation and support sectoral and economy-wide transformations. We support partner countries develop and carry out inspiring visions and pathways for long-term transformation, linking it with near-term action. And of course, we also support early movers, pilot climate measures, and scale-up actions. At the Let's GP, We are very happy to have you all gathered here today to exchange and learn from each other on the importance of integrating and linking development commitment and goals, linking the work of the 2030s agenda, the national adaptation plans, the NDCs, the long-term strategies, and especially, of course, mitigation and adaptation strategies, as they are key for not missing out on opportunities that can help us build resilience and at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Integration is also key for identifying trade-offs between initiatives and better managing the risks associated with competing measures. We have today an incredible team of participants and climate leaders that are joining us in the Peer Learning Summit. We together have more than 400 combined years of experience on different topics. In the spirit of the Let's GP, which is built around the philosophy that peer learning is a key ingredient to drive ambitious climate action, I invite you all to take advantage of the treasure of knowledge here today. Be open and bold to share what you know, and also open to learn from each other. Together with the NAP Global Network and the BMU funded project support for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, SPA, implemented by GIZ, and my colleague Berthe from the BMU as well, we would like to warmly welcome you to the Peer Learning Summit, addressing climate change through the integrated responses, linking adaptation and mitigation. Thank you. Catherine?
Great. Thank you, Felipe. And thank you for highlighting what a great bunch of participants we have here today. And also, I hope everybody noticed that the sponsoring organisations span both adaptation and mitigation. So we have been we've been linking adaptation and mitigation in the design of this event and in the organisations that are supporting it. But as Felipe said, there's a great bunch of participants, and we wanted to now move to get a sense of who's actually here in the room. So it's been great to see some of you introducing yourselves in the chat function. Please do find your way to the chat, and because we'll be using it throughout the session today. So what we're going to do now is we're going to we're going to get to know each other and get to know who's in the room a little bit more. So we're also going to get to use some of the tools that we're using to collaborate. So we'll be one of the tools we'll be using throughout today's session is Mentee Meter and Mentee. So hopefully this is you've used this before. It's very simple to use if you haven't. So could I ask everybody to navigate to mentee.com using maybe your smartphone or another browser on your computer, to go to mentee.com, and you'll find some questions, a question there. Okay.
Could you please repeat the code? There it is, the code.
So the code is 42734622. Okay, so the reason we ask this question is we know that for some people, particularly some of the colleagues in Canada, it is very early right now. So for Annie and Julia, it is only just turning 6 o'clock in the morning. We also think that for some of the participants, it is really quite late. So I wanted to do a particular mention to Dipeshi Joshi in Nepal, for whom we think it is pretty late. So yeah, we know this is the joy of some of these virtual events is that you can bring lots of people from other parts of the world together. The slight disadvantage is that for some people it's very early, and for some people it's very late. Okay. Good, and hopefully there's a good chunk of people for whom this is a civilized time in the mid-afternoon, which is the same for me here in the UK. Okay, right, and the next question. We know we've got a range of people from different different ministries, from different sorts of sectors. So could you use the Mentee to tell us which one is most represents the sector you're in? Great. Unsurprisingly, perhaps a big representation for Ministries of Environment. Anybody else still going? Okay, good. So I can see that, oh, more people coming in. So there's about 20 people using the Mentee Meter at the moment. If you are having problems doing so, do let us know in the chat and we can provide you with some support on that, because we will be using it later on in the session as well. So it's important that you are able to do it, or we can provide you with an alternative way of contributing. Okay, any more? Still some votes, some contributions coming in. As you can see, overwhelmingly you're from Ministries of the Environment or similar. Okay, thanks. So do let us know if if you're having any problems using the Mentee Meter tool. Great, welcome back as everyone comes back into the main room. It's lovely to see all your faces, and it was great to connect with people in the small groups. I hope everybody met some new people and maybe found some familiar faces as well. I know I did, which was great. Good. So how are we doing for time? We're doing well. Okay. So Julia, can we pull up the next slide, please? I'm just really briefly going to talk us through. It was the one before that, if that's all right, please, Julia. That one, that's good. Great. So just really quickly, as everybody knows, this is a three days in a room together and turn that into something virtual. So what we're having is 3 2-hour sessions. That we try to echo the foundational pillars of the peer learning approach. So those pillars are sort of technical input, peer-to-peer exchange, and then reflection and planning. And they broadly map onto the 3 different sessions. So the session today is about framing the issues, really getting us all on a similar page about what are the challenges, what are the trade-offs around linking adaptation and mitigation. The second session will be in a couple of weeks' time. That's much more about learning what people are actually doing, discussing with peers. There'll be much more group work in that session. And then in the third session, it's about moving to action. So that's where we kind of think about, well, what do we do with what we've learned in these previous sessions? So those will be working in groups on topics that we identify at the end of the session too. I should say that another really important part of the peer learning summits is reflection. So taking time to think about what you're hearing and how that applies to your own particular context. And we're trying to build that in through each of these different sessions that we're running. So yeah, this is session 1, and I think now we can go on to the next slide, which outlines the agenda for today. So as you'll see, we're in the first bit, the welcome session. Then we're going to move into a presentation from Catherine Gamper from the OECD, which is a framing presentation. Then they'll see there's a little slot for individual reflections. So we'll put some little pauses into the process so people have a chance to think about what's going on. Then we'll have 2 really interesting and concrete examples. One from Cristina Rodriguez, who's the Director of Adaptation and Climate Change and Desertification in the Government of Peru, and one from Crispin Dove from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, based in St. Lucia. So 2 really concrete examples. We'll have a chance to discuss those amongst ourselves, again, go into a small group discussion before going into a panel discussion. Another little slot to pause and reflect, and then we will talk about the next session. So we'll think about what questions we want to discuss going forward into session 2. I've charged through it, but I hope that's hope that all sounds okay. Do put any questions or comments into the chat function. But I think right now what we're going to do is I'm going to hand over to Annie, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Annie, handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I just wanted to welcome everyone as well. Annika from the NAP Global Network. I may have already communicated with some of you, and it's really lovely to meet some of you in the breakout sessions, recognizing a lot of the names, re-meeting people. And as much as we would have loved to have this meeting actually in person, we're all adapting to our new world. I also wanted to say that I hope that everyone is healthy and safe. And I wanted to also give a shout out to everyone and a special thank you for making the time. Well, we all have a little bit of Zoom fatigue, I'm sure, but I think we hope that this is as interactive as we can make it, and we really hope that you get a lot, take a lot away from this virtual peer learning summit. And to kick us off, I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Catherine Gamper, who leads the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Working Group on Adaptation to Climate Change. And prior to joining the OECD, she's actually worked at the World Bank, where she contributed to research and operational work on disaster risk reduction and development. And before that, Catherine used to be an assistant professor of public finance at the University of Innsbruck in beautiful Austria. And that's also where she obtained her PhD. And we have invited Catherine because the OECD has done some work recently on, or published a recent paper on that highlights the importance of linking adaptation and mitigation, especially in the context of the ongoing discussions around how do we design a green recovery in response to the pandemic, as well as how do we use approaches like nature-based solutions. And I also invite you throughout the presentation to please post your questions in the chat if you have any, because we will follow with a short question and answer period after Catherine's presentation. And with that, I'll move it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Annika. I'm not sure I'd be able to follow the questions in the chat box. So if you can help me.
No worries, I will take care of that.
Excellent. Do you want me to use my video as well, or would that overload our system?
Feel free to have your video on. Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Catherine. As Annika has already kindly introduced myself, I started sitting on a bowl at home, so please mind my movements. But I saw that Felipe was standing, which sounds like an even better option than sitting at home all day on a chair. Anyway, it's a pleasure for me to be able to provide this little sort of kickoff presentation in the beginning of this interesting peer learning event. And I hope I can do it justice to frame a little bit the context and to give a bit of a policy perspective or policy reflection on this topic from an organization that looks a bit across different countries' progress in this area of work, as well as sort of tries to always highlight a bit the opportunities for countries in terms of climate change adaptation and mitigation, opportunities in the sense of like topics that we think are increasingly worth to explore, but may not be as high on the policy agenda yet as other topics. So we see a little bit our role also in exploring these topics and exploring the potential for countries in these kinds of policy. So the contribution that you see today is one that we've been working on since 2 years, I would say now. And it was also a key priority under Saudi Arabia's presidency of the Climate Stewardship Working Group, I should say. And that is now being reflected upon as well by Italy under its G20 presidency. And we had the honor to contribute to that sort of debate, substantively speaking, as well over the course of last year. Next slide, please. So as previous speakers said, when we talk about climate resilience, we know that actions on both fronts are needed. While we need to continue mitigating climate change, it is evident and luckily, thankfully, more and more evident also in the international climate debate that we also need to accelerate our action on the ground when it comes to tackling the impacts of climate change. Now, while a lot of the actions in those two policy areas are very distinct actions, such as thinking about cleaner sources of fuel for cars, or thinking about cleaner sources of energy production in more general, there are areas in which both overlap. Take, for example, the area of mangrove restoration. Mangrove restoration helps us do both. It helps us build carbon sinks, vital carbon sinks, to take carbon out of our atmosphere or reduce the carbon load in our atmosphere. And at the same time, they help us build a protection and give us a buffer against the impacts of climate-related coastal risks, to give an example. Next slide, please. But these sort of examples, they span much beyond the area of nature-based solutions, and I'll be focusing on quite a few of those examples simply because we explored those linkages already quite a bit. But if you think about infrastructure, for example, here I give you two examples of two sort of catastrophic climate-related disasters that we experienced in recent years. One is the Californian Camp Fire in 2018. They caused a tremendous amount of damage. First and foremost, obviously, to a key infrastructure provider, and then all the indirect costs that were sort of connected to not only the destruction of the infrastructure asset itself and the network, but obviously also the disruption that has caused to the state of California as a consequence. The second one is the example of Hurricane Sandy that literally brought New York City or Manhattan to a standstill for a couple of weeks, with millions of commuters being stranded, and obviously a huge amount of direct and indirect economic costs. Next slide, please. But at the same time, infrastructure plays a huge role in affecting climate change. We can think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from infrastructure sort of operations and infrastructure development themselves. We know that 60 to 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by power plants, for example, buildings and transport infrastructure. And infrastructure is also key as a sort of a behavioral leverage in sort of switching from carbon-friendly sources of consumption when we think about public services as well. Next slide, please. Another sector that we think of that we can think about when we think about linkages are cities. Cities are the ones that contribute, obviously, to the impact of climate change, because they're very resource intensive and they're very infrastructure use intensive, and they're very sort of dense socioeconomic agglomerations. But at the same time, those are also the ones that are most severely affected by climate change, because there is such a huge concentration of communities and economic assets and economic activities at stake. So when they're hit by the impacts of climate change, there's a large amount of losses and damages that we observe. At the same time, the sort of negative impacts is that the generally negative environmental impacts that we observe in cities, such as the poor air quality, the degrading quality of water and land, are all things that are multiplied by or exacerbated by the impacts of climate change as well. Next slide, please. So if I would just like to sort of flag, as we speak about linkages, that, to open a bit our imagination and sort of look at all the options we have when we try to identify opportunities, and when we try to identify or when we try to think about increasing these synergies between adaptation and mitigation. In our report specifically, we pointed out 4 big sectors. So in addition to the ones that I just mentioned, obviously one is land, the other one is water, another one is waste, but another one is also the food sector. When we think about, for example, improving soil quality that serves the double purpose of enhancing the carbon storage that we can have in the land, but at the same time, as we improve the quality of the land, we can also increase, for example, absorption capacity of water, and hence reducing flood risks, as an example. Or if we think about urban planning, we can reduce the impacts of extreme heat and the impacts of the urban heat island effect by introducing green spaces or introducing green measures on top of buildings, while at the same time mitigating the impacts of mitigating the sources of climate change by increasing the carbon absorption capacity in cities. Next slide, please. This slide is one in which we would like to demonstrate that when we think about adaptation and mitigation, so on the left-hand side, we have distinct sort of differences between the two in the type of activities, but not only, also in the type of stakeholders that implement them, and also in the type of policymakers that determine the different policy actions. So if you think about these distinct sort of characteristics, there are clear distinctions between the two. But then if you think about synergies, there are those that I just mentioned, and we explore a little bit more of them as I go further in my talk. But what is also extremely important to us is to highlight that there are trade-offs, and those trade-offs do not necessarily involve trade-offs between those two different actions, but also trade-offs with the environment. And I'll explore more of those a little bit later. But for us, it is extremely important that we don't think about synergies as something only uniquely positive, but that we also keep in mind that if we pursue this as a double objective, there may be trade-offs involved, negative trade-offs involved for other environmental objectives, for example. And I'll go into more examples in just a bit. Next slide, please. So why did we think about nature-based solutions so much, and why is this debate so connected? It's because it is for us what we see as a low-hanging fruit in materializing linkages. Why? They can help us. You know, let's revisit, for example, the example I just mentioned earlier on mangroves restoration. They help us decrease greenhouse gas emissions and increase the sources of carbon sinks on our land, in that case, on our coasts, while at the same time helping us protect against harmful impacts from climate change. And what we also know, and this is what we're working on in terms of developing evidence more and more, is that they have a number of co-benefits. One of them being that they can actually contribute to boosting the economy or recovering sort of from the negative impacts of a crisis in an economy in a similar way that infrastructure development does. And this is a point that we're trying to bring across a lot now in the debate on a green recovery after the pandemic. And at the same time, they have a number of human well-being effects by, as I said before, improving air quality, by providing more space for leisure, by improving the quality of the land and the quality of the water. So we see a whole host of co-benefits that we should not disregard when we think about, or when we uniquely try and think about synergies as well. Next slide, please. Here we give two concrete examples. One is upstream reforestation, and one is green roofs and greenways in cities. The mitigation benefits of upstream reforestation is obvious, as it provides, once again, carbon sequestration and storage benefits, while at the same time it helps us reduce flood risks downstream of communities and helps us reduce erosion and landslide risks that are also connected with extreme precipitation events. When you think about green roofs, while they help us reducing, as I said before, the urban heat island effect and reducing the impacts of extreme heat in cities, they also help us mitigate climate change by reducing energy needs, because we reduce the need for heating or for cooling in the winter. Next slide, please. Here, what I'm sharing with you is a concrete example of a large-scale nature-based solution of a city in Germany called Stuttgart, in which nature-based solutions was really applied on a sort of an urban level, on a large scale, to rethink about how nature can be used to improve air quality, to improve the quality of land, and to reduce the negative impacts of climate change. What the German authorities did in Stuttgart is they created huge ventilation corridors across the city, which apparently and arguably existed in the city a long time before modern urban planning came into force. They created a huge amount of open and green spaces and converted prior existing dedicated land to green land, and introduced at the same time institutional levers such as new building codes that incentivized and really scaled up the use of green measures for buildings such as courtyards, facades, and urban gardens. And integrated into sort of this maximizing green spaces was also sort of a blue infrastructure project that increased the number of lakes and rivers in the city as well. And as a result, they converted now 40% of their land area almost to forests, trees, and parks. And as a consequence, they were able to show that extreme and more frequent heat waves, the peaks were massively lowered, and they are hoping for the effect on the reducing or mitigating effect on extreme precipitation events and flood events, also to contribute to minimizing the damages that come out of that for the city. Next slide, please. As I said previously, it's not, unfortunately, all rosy when we think about those two policy areas. So when we identify synergies and we sort of try to maximize them, we should keep in mind important trade-offs. And here, perhaps a bit less easy to read on the screen, I pointed out a few examples. So for example, if we think about forestry, and we think about forest conservation measures for the purpose of sequestering carbon or for the purpose of improving land quality and avoiding land degradation and erosion for the sake of reducing flood risks and landslide risks, there are also trade-offs involved, such as, for example, doing so by way of monocultures that could introduce new environmental issues to forestry growth. They could reintroduce or introduce problems of forests not being heat resistant and hence more susceptible to wildfires and so forth. Or, for example, if we think about urban planning, urban planning could involve, for example, introducing green spaces and blue spaces, as we've just seen in Stuttgart, could also lead to lowering urban density and leading to sprawl. And sprawl, as we all know, has environmental consequences that we are nowadays considering perhaps avoiding. So these trade-offs need to be kept in mind when we think about identifying such synergies. Next slide, please. What we looked at in our work, especially in our contribution last year for the G20, is whether these linkages are actually recognized in national policy agendas. And we did so by looking at both NAPs and NDCs. And as you can see here, again, it might be hard to read, but I invite you all to look at our report, in which you can see this table in more detail and the numbers discussed in a little bit more detail. And what we found by looking at these is that indeed the majority of G20 countries, and indeed also our OECD countries, are actually recognizing the potential of linkages in both their NAPs and their NDCs. And where we, in the sectors that we see them most often recognized, are agriculture, forestry, and land use. But beyond that, unfortunately, we see very few cases or countries that spell out more concretely what the objectives are really in pursuing such linkages. Next slide, please. And that leads us a little bit to the work that we've been doing on nature-based solutions in general. And there, the issue that we have observed, or the challenges that we have observed for countries is that, yes, indeed, they're being recognized at the highest possible levels in national climate policies and related policies such as biodiversity, agriculture, and so forth. But unfortunately, when it comes to implementing them, we still look at very, very ad hoc individual measures, often at a small scale, that are sort of introduced by way of champions and not very systematically. So this is a real issue to sort of exploiting these synergies and linkages more on the ground, at least by way of nature-based solutions, which we consider a low-hanging fruit in that regard. It's not integrated, unfortunately, they are not integrated in wider planning efforts, which could be one of the reasons why there's a bit of a bottleneck in implementing them at a larger scale. And there's little follow-up on the effectiveness and performance. Next slide, please. So what can we do to maximize or increase synergies between adaptation and mitigation? Well, what we think as a first step is obviously to improve the coordination between policy agendas, both on the adaptation and the mitigation side, because it's true that they do stand still quite a little bit apart from each other in the countries that we closely work with. Then what we think what could help is definitely adjust the reporting mechanisms by countries on their climate actions in a way that they also capture linkages and not just actions on either sides. Then another leveraging tool that we think about is decision-making tools that can help us facilitate the alignment of consideration for project managers, because those are the ones on the ground that in the end need to sort of evaluate them and actually make them happen. And what could help in addition to that is obviously to document country practices a little more systematically so as to inspire actions by other countries as well. Next slide, please. And to conclude, what we should say is that we see the COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity. Many countries are using these recovery phases in which, or that are being started in quite a number of countries already, and others are probably in line to do so soon, as a way to maximize those synergies and strive to achieve climate resilience in a sort of a coordinated way. And measures that reinforce both adaptation and mitigation, including but not exclusively through nature-based solutions, can create and sustain jobs. And I think we've shown that a little bit through our work in a similar way that oftentimes policymakers hope to see in recovery efforts through large-scale grey infrastructure development. So hopefully this can make a contribution in that debate as well, and build and also bring solid evidence that it can do so. And a not negligible point, as many countries become conscious about using this recovery phase as a sort of a path-breaking moment in which they can set their economic development in the future up on a path that is more sustainable. We also have the argument to give that obviously the co-benefits both for the environment and for human well-being are important arguments to support such measures, at least as part of the mix of recovery efforts by countries. Annika, I think that's it from my side. Answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This was very informative. Thank you so much. I do actually have a couple questions, but I want to give obviously our participants the opportunity to ask questions first. And one question came in, and I'm just going to fire it right at you. Could you please further elaborate a little bit more on the negative trade-offs of mitigation adaptation actions, because this is often something that is overlooked when we develop policy responses?
Yes, there's plenty of examples that we have in our report, but I'm very happy to share a couple of more now for our discussion today. So for example, if you decide to build a hydropower dam, which is considered one that helps us manage water scarcity, and if well managed, it can also be a cleaner source of energy production than fossil fuels. That would be a good example for infrastructure development that fosters synergies along those two objectives. However, as we all are very well aware, depending on the size of the dam and depending on the conceptualization of a dam, it can also have extremely harmful impacts on the environment, on the loss of biodiversity in a certain environment, the disturbance of ecosystems in that environment, as well as sort of downstream risks for communities if certain safeguards have not been observed. And we've seen catastrophic events with dam failures and accidents in the past, even only just in the conceptual phase. This would be one example. Or another example is monocultures. As I mentioned, one in forestry, but there's also plenty of such examples in the area of agriculture in terms of crops that we plant. Then in urban development, there's a lot of measures that we would consider measures that help us adapt to a changing climate, such as the use of climatization, ACs, that can at the same time help us adjust to extreme temperatures. And if we use sort of clean sources of energy, they might be acceptable in terms of a mitigation measure as well. However, in the grand scheme of things, I guess such measures do sort of perpetuate the path that we're on rather than helping us getting off it. So these are sort of the kind of trade-off examples that you can, I'll stop here, but there's quite a number in the report that you can look at and that we think need to be really kept in mind when we think about synergies in a too narrow-minded policy objective way.
I think this is really actually fascinating. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but we do have a little bit of extra time. We have some time planned in the second hour where we have more opportunity to discuss some of those issues. Before we move on into our small break, we would like to just ask you to reflect on the presentation that we have just seen. And for that, we're just going to move back into our Mentee Meter poll. And it should still be open if you haven't closed it on either your smartphone or your web browser. You can use that again. And what we would like to know from you is, what do you see as the major challenge in your context? And Catherine, I think, elaborated nicely on some of the opportunities or some recommendations, I would say, how we can strengthen our synergies around adaptation and mitigation. But sometimes sounds easier than done. And from our work that we have done as well, from talking to people and also the survey that we sent out before the event, would like to ask you again what you see as a major challenge in your context, and just give you a couple minutes here. And I hope everyone can read this, but we have identified 4 larger areas, and it's political will and mandate, which seems to back up a lot of points already. There's coordination fatigue, capacity and human resources, understanding and assessing synergies and trade-offs, something we just touched on. There's also power dynamics within government and between different ministries. And of course, the focus and content of different policy processes. With that, we mean, sometimes a certain process will have more attention and might be even legally binding versus another process based on the framework we're talking about. And then often, for example, mitigation may just seem a little bit more important than adaptation, and sometimes it's difficult then to receive attention. Okay, this is great. I see like an equal split between political will and mandate, power dynamics, focus and content, and also understanding and assessing synergies, which is really interesting. I'm actually glad to see that it's not necessarily coordination fatigue and capacity and human resources. And thank you for providing this answer, but we have one more just quick follow-up question. If you could take the time to also add, so you've identified a challenge, but why is this a challenge for you? And I think we're just asking to put a very short input in text you can provide via Mentee. Why do you think this is a big, or one of the biggest challenges in your particular context? And I also see that a couple more questions are coming in. Please feel free to continue to send in your questions, and I promise we will pick them up in the second half of our session and during the second discussion. Okay. Stakeholders tend to defend the thematic turf. Yeah, I can relate to that. Different interest, who owns the discourse, how to integrate each other, absence of targets, encourage some sectors to take actions, especially in adaptation. I think that's an interesting answer, especially given what Catherine talked about, the trade-offs and synergies. when we feel like this is a good mitigation or adaptation option. But we sometimes forget about the what are the unintended consequences potentially for of the coin. Need to comprehensive vision, human resources linkages to funding. Yeah. Decision makers are often reluctant to see such issues as priorities. Now programming, yeah, would be a lot of work, yes. Need to understand the pros and cons, trade-offs. Feel free to continue to submit your answers here. I think, Catherine, we are going to take and then we will come back and we will move right into, so I'll see everyone in 5 minutes. Okay, I think we're back. That was very quick 5 minutes, but I had a chance to fill up my coffee cup. And the sun is also now rising here, which is wonderful. We're going to move right into our second part of our session 1 today, looking at really interesting country inputs and examples on approaches to integrate climate policy making. And I'm super excited to introduce our first speaker, Cristina Rodriguez, and she is the Director of Adaptation to Climate Change and Desertification of the General Directorate of Climate Change and Desertification of the Ministry of Environment in Peru. That's a long title. And she will share with us some of the important work that Peru has been doing on nature-based solutions. And I know that Peru has been a leader on nature-based solutions and has also been one of the vanguard countries on leading the nature-based action track under the Global Commission on Adaptation. And I've already had a chance to hear a lot of the really fantastic work that's going on. Cristina is an economist with a master's degree in environmental economics from the University of York and a master's in sustainable development from the University of Rotterdam. And she has extensive experience in formulation and evaluation of public investment projects and the implementation of policies in disaster risk management, as well as adaptation to climate change. Over to you, Cristina. And yes, the presentation is up, and just let us know when you want us to move to the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Annika, for the long introduction and my long title. Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good night, depending when you are. First, I would like to thank the NAP Global Network, the Long Emission Development Strategy Global Partnership, and GIZ to invite Peru to be part of this peer learning summit, and to have the opportunity to share about our work around nature-based solutions and the synergy in adaptation and mitigation. In Peru, we firmly believe that nature is the best ally for a sustainable economic reactivation and a climate action that promotes well-being and sustainable development. If you help me with the next slide, I will divide this presentation in 4 items. The first 2 will give us a little more country context, how we apply a comprehensive climate change management definition, and also our progress in the National Adaptation Plan, who is currently in the final step to the approval, and then move on to the MBAs in relation with NDCs and also the priorities and challenges around them. Next slide, please. Well, first I would like to start with a comprehensive climate change management concept. This is, next please. This is a definition that was introduced by the Framework Law on Climate Change in 2018. And it means that the incorporation of climate change actions in the country's development process through public policies that are put in place in a participatory, multi-sectoral, multi-level, and multi-stakeholder spirit. With this, next please, this is emphasized in the law, and also this law and its regulation has strengthened the institutional framework and governance by establishing responsibilities at the national, regional, and local levels, and by creating different management bodies with relevant stakeholders, not only from the states, also non-state stakeholders. In this law, also ecosystem-based approach is recognized in mitigation and in adaptation decisions. Next, please. As many countries now, we also working in our national adaptation plan. As I said before, we are in the last stage to be approved, and hopefully this month we can release the document. The national adaptation plan is looking for the whole orientation and adaptation with a vision to 2050. One more, please, and just to tell you a little bit more, the process that we did for the construction of the NAP has been a very participatory and legitimacy process that had included all sectors, all regional and local main local governments, as well as not stakeholders. We did this we started this before the pandemic, and we were able to finish during the pandemic using as many the virtual tools. We so proud because we were able to include representative of the indigenous population, helping them with these tools to participate in this process. What we find in the NAP mainly is a conceptual and methodologic model for adaptation and the development of climate-related risk scenarios, and the priorities for adaptation in 2030 and 2050. For 2030, we count with 92 NDCs for adaptation and 13 strategy lines of actions. Next slide, please. And in general, in the NAP, we have as a main objective to reduce or avoid current and future damage, losses, and alterations triggered by climate change, climate-related hazards, and also to take advantage of the opportunity that climate change offers for sustainable and resilient development. As you may see, ecosystems are part, it's in the middle in the subjects, are part of the important subjects that we aim to protect by reducing its vulnerability to climate change, but also ecosystems are key to ensure a better adaptation. So we have a number of measures that are focused on ecosystem, basins, and territories. One more, please. Moving on to our NDCs and how they connected with the nature-based solutions. Next, please. I would like just as a context mention that Peru is now focusing in the implementation of 154 NDCs, 92 related with adaptation, and 62 are mitigation measures. We increased last year, announced last year, an increase of ambition in both. In mitigation, now we have as a goal 40% reduction of emission in 2030. One more, please. And in this total number of NDCs, we did one more. Thank you. In this, the whole 54 NDCs. We studied them and we identified that at least 33 NDCs measures are related to nature-based solutions. You see there the different type of measures that we have, especially in forests. We have a number of measures in adaptation that are completely related to MBAs, and also with mitigation, at least 14 of them are also completely related to nature-based solutions. And why is that? Because they are actions aimed to protect, restoring, or sustainably management ecosystem, which align this intervention with a definition of nature-based solutions that is considered in the UNC. So to do this, we did some studies. One more, please. Here there's like a few examples of some of these measures. Ecosystem restoration to maintain landscape connectivity and reduce impact both for extreme weather weather events. Sorry. Also, we have management of natural grassland to ensure sustainable livestock and reduce their vulnerability to climate change. So one more, please. This is some example of this category of NDCs. Moving on also to our NBA's priority and challenges. First, it's important to emphasize that we see and we recognize that NBC actions are means to demonstrate synergy between mitigation and adaptation, will result in favor of ecosystem services and development. So we have cases where a single intervention in either adaptation or mitigation can have co-benefits. For example, a community forest management mitigation measure can also have value in ecosystem resilience. But saying this, we also see that we need to increase data collections in order to identify these potential benefits. Saying this is we need more quantitative information for see and demonstrate more these synergies. One more, please. As also was mentioned before, for Anica, Peru is currently recognized as a vanguard country by the Nature-Based Solution Action Track of the Global Adaptation Commission. And this is because we sort of show good experience implementing nature-based solutions project or initiative through natural infrastructure or ecosystem-based adaptation projects. We also commit to scale MBAs and in planning and public policies such as our National Adaptation Plan and other platform in our law, and currently also we updating our national strategy of climate change, and there is another instrument where we're gonna emphasize this approach. One more, please. Here some numbers of how nature-based solutions demonstrate that are cost-effective solutions. Some numbers that we took from the Global Commission for Adaptation. Investing in natural infrastructure to face the risks associated with the climate provides a return on investment of 4 to 1. And even if we, between this year and 2030, investment in resilience infrastructure could generate 4.2 trillion of benefits. So it's really important to have also these numbers on mind to promote more nature-based solutions. So to summarize the progress, one more please, to sort of summarize the progress that we have in nature-based solution strategies. In terms of management instruments, we have our framework law, climate change and its regulations that recognize the approach of ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation. Is not only for adaptation. Also, we including the concept in the national strategy for climate change that will have a vision for 2050. As I said, we study and see that 33 NDCs at the national level already are related, strongly related with nature-based solutions. We also have a number of guidelines and public investment tools that aim to facilitate investment in natural capital. And we are still working on that, being every time more specific with different type of natural infrastructure. In terms of action, we have a couple of lessons learned from different experience in the implementation of adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation projects. Also, we have done some of this project in protected natural areas. And we are part of the community of MBAs to promote exchange learning. One more, please. In part of this action, also I would like just to share with you that we are implementing for a couple of years already payment for ecosystem services. In Peru, we call it MERECE, is the acronym in Spanish. Is that we call also this mechanism that are instrument to allow generating, challenging, and investing in actions aimed at the conservation, recovery, and sustainable use of ecosystem as a source of ecosystem services. And one more, please. There is, for instance, a project we call MERECE FIDA project that has successfully experienced in the implementation of the mechanism. So far, they help with to find these voluntary agreements between contributors and retributors. So far, we have 37 conservation and recovery sub-projects financed that cover around 40,000 hectares to conserve and recover, and it covers around 1,500 families that are benefit. Sorry. One more, please. So this is also part of our actions. To close this this presentation, I would like to highlight some of our priorities related to nature-based solution, and also that will help us to improve synergy between mitigation and adaptation. We want to keep integrating MBA's concept into the main climate change instrument, along with further research on their outcomes. Doing this also because we already have identified measures that to work in the implementation of enabling conditions, and also focus in a territorial, multi-stakeholder and multi-sector approach. As I mentioned in some of the cost benefits information, it's important also doing this, disseminate information about the benefits of nature-based solutions as more cost-effective measures to leverage financing. So this is a summary of our main priorities, and we hope this year and next year to keep improving in this work. With this, I would like to finish the presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm here if you have, if you want any further information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And before we start into our second part of the conversation. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. First of all, moving from large countries to very small countries that, of course, face different kind of challenges, but are also doing a lot of work on integrating adaptation and mitigation and the nexus around it. And so I'm excited to introduce to you Crispin Joubert, who is the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Coordinator with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And before that, he actually served as the Chief Sustainable Development and Environment Officer with the government of St. Lucia. And he holds a Master's of Science focused on climate change from the University of the West Indies. So yeah, Crispin will share with us how small development island states have been strengthening the linkages between adaptation and mitigation, and a specific focus here on the energy sector. Over to you, Crispin.
Thanks. Thank you, Annika, and good day, everyone. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Yes, so the Eastern Caribbean is vulnerable. We are located in a zone where we are susceptible to hydrometeorological events, hurricanes in particular, floods and other extreme droughts as well as earthquakes, and as some of you may be aware from what's happening in our neighboring island of St. Vincent, volcanic eruptions. Now, these events have the ability, and especially the climate events, related events, have the ability to devastate ecosystems and infrastructure, ruin our economies, and stymie development. So from the picture up top, you'll see that destruction. That's what happened in Dominica in 2017 with Hurricane Maria, when they lost 200% of their GDP overnight. So for us, adaptation is an urgent priority. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So, but for us, despite the fact that adaptation is an overriding priority, greenhouse gas emissions reduction also makes sense, because despite our minuscule greenhouse gas emissions, I'm talking about, for example, in the case of St. Lucia, 0.0015 of 1%, of the global figure. Our countries are keen to pursue mitigation actions to, among other things, contribute to our own survival. Because if we are vulnerable and we want to show the world that even if our efforts are small, we're still prepared to make the effort and the sacrifice. We want to reduce energy costs because we have some of the highest energy costs in the world on a kilowatt hour basis. We want to reduce our energy dependence, especially on imported fossil fuels, which, as you know, are what drive most of our greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we want to flatten the energy volatility curve, because when the prices of oil go up and down, and they provide a certain degree, cause a certain degree of volatility in our economies, which can have significant impacts, knock-on impacts on on the cost of food and so on, especially where we import. And we also want to protect the environment. And finally, we at this point in time, we want to kind of power our way out of the coronavirus pandemic for a green recovery. Next slide, please. So for us, we see opportunities to blend adaptation and mitigation. And yesterday I was toying with the word adaptation, and we see two particular areas. There are others, but two of particular interest. And I'll start with the one on the right. That is through land use, forestry, managing the use of our land and agriculture, trying to make sure that our agricultural practices, for example, result in as little emissions as possible, and also trying to restore and manage our forests to secure as much sequestration as possible, while still maximizing the opportunities from ecotourism and sustainable livelihoods in the forest as possible. And we also see solarization, to coin it, to use a term that some people do, as a means of, on our critical buildings, for example, our hospitals, our health centers, our community centers, emergency shelters, like this building, the multi-purpose building on the left. We see these as areas of an opportunity to achieve mitigation and adaptation, build resilience in both spheres. And this is important because when a hurricane passes and hits your knocks out your system, your power system, you may be off the grid for days and weeks. And if you're in a hurricane shelter, well, usually days in recent time, in some cases, weeks in some countries. But if that happens, at least you have some degree of fallback in terms of being able to keep medicines and foodstuffs, cool and still usable, like your insulin for people who are diabetic, and also allow for some lighting and so on in the buildings. So that is one opportunity that we see. So next slide, please. So based on that, and looking at the second example of solar, we've recently launched an initiative where we floated. We're going to formally launch it in the next couple of weeks, the Eastern Caribbean Solar Challenge, which is our race to the sun. And the aim is to see the increased deployment of renewable energy technologies in support of corporate, household, national, and regional goals to increase energy and climate resilience while contributing to the protection of the climate. And basically, it's going to work like this. Private sector is going to self-invest in small and medium scale PV units. So they're doing that already, but everybody's going to, we're basically going to get a chance to register this under one single banner. And the private sector will also contribute to public PV units, so like, for example, a school and so on, as part of their corporate social responsibility. And also provide financial and related incentives, for example, credit and insurance facilities to incentivize. Then households will self-invest in PV units, as they've been doing, but hopefully at a more rapid rate. And development partners are free to contribute towards PV installations on public buildings. And finally, from the government, the public sector policy and legislative, the government will take policy, legislative and fiscal measures to support and facilitate deployment. So in some countries, what you may have situations where the government might say, okay, I'm reducing the value-added tax on imported photovoltaic equipment or components, so that can reduce the price to the potential investor in solar. Next slide, please. Now you can ask why solar and why not wind and others? Well, solar is increasingly accepted as a viable and price competitive alternative. It is scalable from streetlights to household to grid scale, and so it offers a chance for virtually everybody to participate at all levels. It provides visibility for climate action taken, so solar panels are clearly visible and they can generate measurable results. And very important for this conversation, they can come in the form of hurricane-proof installations that promote both climate mitigation and climate adaptation, as I indicated. And interestingly, I think at this point, they start to benefit from a growing pool of expertise in the region. And finally, in that context, they also benefit multiple sectors. It's relevant for tourism, for agriculture, for the health sector, for everybody. So for households. So that is why we think it's an avenue where we can really get, collective, a groundswell of engagement from everyone. Next slide, please. And the target we're working with, we're looking at by 2025, at least 6.5 megawatts of new small and medium PV installed in the Eastern Caribbean. And we're looking at but including by 2023, 0.45 on public buildings and 1.55 megawatts, totaling 2 megawatts by 2023. And that's not necessarily talking about the grid scale or utility scale investments by the electricity companies. That's really small and medium, where we try to democratize the process and give everybody a chance to play. So that is it. I think I have one more slide, which is thank you very much. And anybody who's interested in attending the launch, we'll be launching the Solar Challenge on the 20th of May. I will post my email in the chat. So if anybody's interested, just drop me an email. And we can, or in fact, I'll just drop it. I'll put our unit email, and anybody's interested can feel free just to send us an email. And let's just head us launch of Solar Challenge, and we'll take it from there. We'll respond to you. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Crispin. This was great. And we're going to move right into the conversation. And I invite Christina, Catherine, and Crispin to join me for that. And I can see a flurry of questions and conversations going on in the chat, which is really exciting, and is also the part that makes me a little bit sad that we can't be in a room together and exchange our thoughts and questions face to face. But for the time being, I hope this works well. And a question came in, Crispin, which I find is very interesting, and I want to ask it right away. That's related to the energy cost is quite high and a big issue in the Caribbean, and the investment in renewable energy, it obviously provides an important opportunity, but also there's still the risk of extreme weather events, and how do you deal with the and the frequency of the increased frequency of weather events, and how do you deal with that conflict and make sure that any of these investments are actually then protected, for example, in solar energy?
Good question, thanks. Well, actually, now there are PV installations that can withstand category 5 hurricanes. And that is what we're promoting. In fact, under the Solar Challenge, we're actually going to have some guidelines for persons, or entities looking to install solar. What grade of PV units and mounts and so on, brackets and so on should be used to ensure that they're not blown up by the next hurricane. Okay, and so that is something that we've recognized. So thanks. And the building I showed you in the picture is actually engineered or redesigned to withstand a Cat 5 hurricane.
That's very interesting. That's great. Yeah, and I'm just realizing also, there's opportunities for linkages and synergies between adaptation and mitigation across many sectors that we heard in all three presentations. And just as a very quick follow-up, actually, on this question, did you engage the private sector in the PV unit, and how did you do it?
Okay. Yes. Well, we've been having the Solar Challenge is being launched on an initiative we have known as the Caribbean NDC Finance Initiative, which is really trying to accelerate NDC implementation in the Eastern Caribbean, and it is supported by politically by the UNFCCC Secretariat, the NDC Partnership. And over the last couple of years, we have been engaging with the private sector. It's what we call a non-traditional conversation, because government and intergovernmental agencies in our region haven't had a long history of doing this. So we've been engaging them, and we've been reaching out to them, sensitizing them about the challenge, and where possible, we're getting their feedback. And also we work with partners who work with the private sector, who've also kind of given us their input for, with regard to that. So this is where we're going at. So for the launch, we expect that we also invited the private sector to participate. And so the conversation continues. Like I said, it's being launched in May. So we expect it to grow from there as we intend to engage in more outreach to private sector, households, and so on with time.
And I do want to follow up on Christina's presentation, and there's also a flurry of questions around nature-based solutions. It's just such a hot topic these days, and there's a lot of questions around standards and how do we engage the private sector in nature-based solutions. But I also noticed that in the examples that you shared in Peru, so many of them involve local communities and the subnational level. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how do you engage those different levels, but also actors like the private sector that obviously play a huge role, and there's a potential for how do we deal with the trade-offs when we have to make decisions on economic development versus protection of land, for example.
Thank you, Annika, for pointing out this important issue, how involved other actors at the local level and also private sector. Here, I would like to emphasize that when we prepare and we decide about which adaptation and mitigation measure will be implementing the next year, we did this job with all sectors. It's not a decision that the Ministry of Environment took alone. We have even formally a group working during more than almost 2 years. And in this process, we also implement some like events that we call dialogue. And in these events, what we try to identify closely are who are the other actors that we need to be in the picture to take these decisions. So these dialogues, that dialoguemos in Spanish, is something that we still implementing. We, for instance, now we're doing to jump into the private sector. We organize a private sector. We have some groups, some companies are more interested in implement NDCs, and with them we doing that dialogues, then dialoguemos, and then they decide. Especially they decide what is the main topic, and together sitting in the same virtual room now, we call the private sector. We are also the public sector and other partners that wants to discuss and deal with a specific measure, how we implement it, what they need, what enabling conditions they need to move forward in a specific measures. So we use this dialoguemos as a tool to help us to understand, to be close more with these different actors. And also, when I mentioned we have certain management bodies, we have a National Commission of Climate Change, and there all these actors has a representation. We have a group of, every actor has a decide who will represent them, and there we also in this commission we're trying to give them all the information, and we receive recommendations and different topics that they want to increase better. So that's the way we included all these actors.
Great, thank you. I would like to follow up on that with another question again on nature-based solutions. There have been a few questions coming in around standards and kind of guidelines. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Peru's experience on if you use a specific type of guideline or standard for the implementation of nature-based solutions. And then if Catherine maybe could follow up on any kind of examples that you are aware of of nature-based solutions where specific guidelines or standards have been applied, recognizing that we are in an ongoing conversation around standards and guidelines for nature-based solutions, but there's a huge call for that we need some kind of common agreement on them. But yeah, if Christina, if you could start, and then Catherine maybe can follow up.
Well, we start about talking about guidelines. We start focus more in eco-based adaptation a few years ago, and we did that with the support of international cooperation that helped us to move forward. How to include this natural infrastructure in investment, and especially in the moment we were building the NDCs. So we start with that concept, but also when we include the concept in our law and in our regulations, we didn't take the whole international concept. We put it in the context of the country. So is what we have with this specific ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation, including even we talk about ecosystem-based mitigation in our law, something that is not very common, but we decide to do that. And about the natural-based solution, of course, there are some standards now, and we are participating in a lot of events and discussing this. When we ask how many of our NDCs are related to natural-based solutions, we did a mix. We use the concept of ecosystem-based adaptation, but also take some of the guidelines, international guidelines about this, especially the one that is promote, but the UICN,
IUCN, yeah.
IUCN, yeah. We try to like don't get attached only to one concept. We try to see many and then do it in a better what is better for our context. So when I mentioned that we have 19 NDCs in adaptation that are related to nature-based solution, it's not only one international definition, we use different one. So so far is that, and we want to scale this concept also in our national strategy of climate change, and there probably we're gonna do some adjustment too. So we take into account the general concept, but also we look at our specific case.
Feel free to follow up, Catherine.
Very impressive, Christina. we thought about standards a lot as we approached our work in the beginning, but then also throughout the process as we got prompted oftentimes. And we sort of refrained from really adding to this debate for the time being, because we thought it was much more important to sort of concentrate on what are the sort of the policy issues countries are grappling with. We just wanted to make sure in the way we approach nature-based solutions, we were very mindful of the fact that it is being a sort of a catchword or a word that is being used to revamp, I think, a lot of things that we've been doing for quite a while before. Ecosystem-based adaptation is one such areas of activity. Another one is sort of natural climate solutions and the like. So we wanted to make sure to simply distinguish NBS from what, for example, conservation activities aim at, or similar sort of natural resources by themselves are focused on, but to underline the angle that NBS are developed first and foremost to address a certain societal challenge. And for us, that was the distinguishing point of NBS from other nature conservation activities. And then what we were keen to understand is what Christina says in how NBS can be integrated in systems that have been primarily conceived for traditional infrastructure development, for example. So we made sure to look into countries' regulations. For example, when we worked with Mexico and the UK, we looked specifically into land use planning and building code regulations and agricultural regulations to sort of see where and how space is being made for nature-based solutions, or in infrastructure development, how this space is perhaps not being made, or how the existing regulations impede NBS from entering in there, for example, in public procurement processes or in any kind of public tender processes. If you don't have a specific regulations of the method or the tool you can use for NBS, then it will be very hard for the ones that are drafting the tender to include and foster nature-based solutions in that regard, or understanding their benefits without having sort of numbers and methodologies to evaluate those. They will never make the cracking cost-benefit analysis, as Christina mentions. So for us, these were sort of the kind of standards we were thinking of more concretely in the different policies, but obviously being mindful and contributing to the debate, the ongoing debate, such as the development of the IUCNs then.
Great, thank you so much. I hope it's okay. I want to ask one more question, and it's really a little bit more process oriented, because there's comments that came up around synergies and trade-offs. And I think that the graphic, Catherine, that you had introduced is quite helpful to understand, conceptually understand what this is about. But from a more practical sense, we have adaptation teams, we have mitigation teams, we have people working on a development planning process. And how can we make sure that conversations actually take place? So what are some of the enabling factors that need to be in place at a country level, that we don't continue to work in silos, but that we actually actively engage with each other and seek out and understand the synergies and trade-offs? also keeping in mind that doing an assessment of trade-offs and synergies is quite complex, or can be very complex, but can also be potentially be more simplistic, at least, so it takes place at some level. But yeah, I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think are some of the enabling factors that need to be in place that we overcome some of those coordination barriers that are, I feel like the first line of we need to like cross before we can really design interventions that both deliver adaptation and mitigation benefits. Maybe Crispin, can I ask you first?
How can I put it? One of the things you have to recognize is that, you know, I'm starting from where we began a long time ago. When I started out in the climate change business years ago, we were starting where adaptation and mitigation were very far apart. In other words, adaptation is adaptation, mitigation is mitigation, and never the twain shall meet. Okay, so over time, we've seen, I would say, a blurring of the lines, but we've seen it coming more closer together. Okay, and in that regard, we've begun to see that there is the opportunity for adaptive mitigation or mitigative adaptation, whatever you want to call it. The question of how to handle it and how to coordinate it has arisen because, you know, even within my organization, right, we have an energy unit, we have a climate change resilient unit. Now, the energy unit is very often seen as, you know, as dealing with the utilities, dealing with, you know, certain stakeholders, again, who at the ground level have not, you do not always see themselves as natural, you know, collaborators, so to speak. Okay, so I think one of the things we have to do at one sense is to kind of remove the silo and you know, let people better understand that, you know, there is opportunities for cross-flow information, cross-flow of, you know, that your activities affect mine. All right, and if I can just move away from the energy realm for a while and move into the how do I say it? Into the land use change and forestry. A lot of people do not see a role for forestry and so on in mitigation because it's not properly understood. So I think one of the things that we need to do generally is to keep that cross-pollination and exchange of ideas between sectors. And it often means convincing people, senior political, decision makers, that there's even a need to have this conversation. And again, without being too long with it, 20 years ago, when I started in the climate change field, climate change didn't roll off people's tongues as easily as it did. People thought that, you know, it was going to affect, you know, just affecting people in the higher latitudes, you know, close to the North Pole and what have you, and you know, they're the ones you see polar bears on ice floes and so on. It does not affect us. But over time, people have realized that it's changed. So essentially, the need, so issues like collaboration, coordination, and so on, I think there has to, in our region where we have capacity constraints in terms of resources and in terms of human resources, we have to find and be as creative as possible in trying to synergize and try to blend the conversations with, you know, without putting too much of a strain in terms of, you know, of the resources required because we are resource constrained. So I know I've, you know, gone far and wide, but I've tried to explain what the realities are on the ground and try to, you know, to bring it in closer. So I hope that has helped.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was, in the interest of time, consider those really good closing remarks. And I wanted to say, I think you said earlier, I think you came up with a new word for adaptation and mitigation, which I think is great, and we'll try and capture that. And then I also thought it was really interesting, Christina, you said, you know, that the NDC provides an opportunity to also really highlight and communicate synergies between adaptation and mitigation, which I think Peru is a really excellent example of. And I wanted to just thank you all for your time, but don't run away yet. I hand it over back to Catherine. We're just going to do a very quick wrap up. But again, I want to thank our speakers for your time and your experience and your expertise that you shared with us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So, yeah, so there will be more chances for for talking through those examples. I just wanted to, what I want to do now is really quickly, before you rush off with your days, I'd like you to take a minute to think about what is one insight or idea from the previous discussion or from what you've heard today that you could take away and use in your context. So what have you thought, oh yeah, I might do that, I could think about that in my context. So again, we'd like to suggest you use that on the Mentee and share one idea or insight that you think you could use in your context. Put the link to Mentee and the code is in the chat.
Hello? Hello?
Okay, so some ideas are coming in now. If you're not able to access the Mentee for whatever reason, take this time just to have a quick think, scribble something down, or even put it in the chat.
It's too bad that you can't put little likes on some comments. That would be a great addition to this tool.
Great. Okay, so hopefully everybody's had a minute or so to think and reflect. I think somebody mentioned that there are really good practice examples out there. I think that's certainly something I've taken away, and that leads us really nicely into the next session, where on the 18th of May, where we'll be looking at more good practice examples as well. So we've heard some really interesting ones today. And in the next session on May the 18th, we'll be hearing from Michael Hordofer, and apologies if I'm pronouncing this wrong, from Ethiopia. We'll be hearing from Uname Gordon from Jamaica, from Pilar Jacob from Mexico, and Dana Dana from Kazakhstan. So hearing of examples from 4 very different countries, and hopefully they'll all have something that you'll be able to take away and apply in your context. So just as we begin to think about the next session, we just wanted to get a really quick readout from you about what you thought of this session. So we're going to do 2 more questions on the Mentee, if we can. Thank you. Okay. So just get a sense of what you thought about today's session. This is the first of 3. We want to make sure that we are getting them right. Oh, right, okay, that is looking super positive. Only 5 people so far. We'll leave this one open just a little bit longer. Of course, we're really happy if you've got any feedback about the process, about the content. We really want to hear it. Okay, this is the beginning of 3 sessions, and they need to be relevant for you. The next question we're going to ask, I'll leave this one open. Oh, okay. The next question is, what would you like to explore further in sessions 2 and 3? There's probably some questions you've still got, some things you want to hear about. this is particularly in session 2, we'll be hearing from the speakers that I just mentioned. This will help them to think about what they might talk about. And in session 3, we'll be having 4 different working groups, each focusing on one challenge or question or working something forward, spending a good chunk of time in that final session working on something together. So this will help us to get a sense of what your interests are in this area. I hope I can't hear my family in the background. Great, this is really useful. Great. So thank you for adding those. I think that one can stay open for a little bit longer. We'll do some sort of analysing it afterwards and come up with some ideas. So I have a few more things to say to wrap this up. So one is we're leaving this room open. We'll finish formal engagements any second now, but we are leaving this room open. The second thing is that we have created like a notice board for this session, for these sessions. There was a link in the message. It was the wrong. I'm really sorry. The link to the mural board in the email that went out yesterday was the wrong link. So the correct link we will post into the chat now, and we will also send out in a follow-up email. Now that's going to be a home for all the materials that are shared. So we'll put the presentations up on there, we'll put the recordings up on there, any things that get mentioned, any papers that get mentioned, we'll put up there, and we'll try and use that as like a holding place for this whole series of events. And I think I just want to finish by saying thank you so much to all of the speakers today for such thoughtful and interesting presentations. There's been some good feedback on the chat. And see you again on Tuesday, May the 18th at the same time, whether that was early in the morning, in the middle of the day or in the evening. We're back on Tuesday the 18th. Thank you everybody, and we're going to close this formal session now. Feel free to hang around for more informal chats afterwards. So thank you everybody. Oh, actually before we go, could everybody put their videos back on? I knew there was something I had to remember. Let's just see each other before we go. We'll try and do an equivalent of we'll do a screenshot instead of a group photo. Okay. I've got you all in gallery view and I can see your faces. I mean, I've swapped over at the top right. If anybody's not sure how to do that, you can see everybody, get into gallery view and you can see everybody there. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to take a screenshot, which is the equivalent of a group photo, and then close formal proceedings right now. So thank you everybody. Give a big wave, and if you need to go, please do. If you want to hang around, please do that too. Bye. Thank you.